Hello, hello. Thank you everybody for being here today. Today we're lucky enough to get a chat with Amelia Vergara, the author of La Belle Famille. And we're doing things a little bit differently. Today we're going to talk about historical fiction writing and just how to go about it, where to begin, what your end goals are, and primarily how do you balance history and truth with a novel while still remaining kind of true to the story and the I guess the truth, the history. Um, so we're doing things a little bit differently, and we have kind of a list of questions, and we want to make this authentic. So without further ado, Amelia, how do you go about approaching research, and what advice would you give writers looking for credible or primary sources?
So I honestly will often start if I'm researching a specific event, I'll go to Wikipedia first, but that can't be the main resource. But you'll find that in the Wikipedia over like they have a nice overview of an event and they have, if it's a good article, it has a lot of sources linked. So if you go down to the sources, you can find a lot of like really good sources and then go and delve deeper. There's also like they cite books, so you can find books that way. I find that a really nice place to start. And then once I find those resources, they often branch into other ones, like books have more books that they cite. And so that's like where I begin is Wikipedia. But I don't stay there.
Honestly, I feel like that's for us growing up, whether it was always an essay or some sort of project, and the professor's always saying, do not use Wikipedia. But as you said, Wikipedia itself is something, but if you go down to the sources, it's
Mhm.
such a wide variety. And obviously, not every source is created equal,
Yes.
but having that and then being able to branch into books, and we've all read a book that has that 50 pages of notes at the end. And
Yeah.
I feel like that's one and the same as well.
Yeah, and I found like some of the books are so obscure that it's very hard to get them, but through like the interlibrary loan, I've been able to pick up books that I wouldn't have been able to find otherwise. So I do that, like go to the interlibrary loan, get all these books that I've made a list of. I don't necessarily read the entire book. Some of them I do because I enjoy them. They're kind of fun. But sometimes I'm just looking for a specific like section of a book. And then yeah, there's a lot of good resources as well. Like if you're doing American like historical fiction for the US, the National Archives is a great place to like find like primary resources. You can see like how people sp like wrote back then, how they phrased things, though you have to kind of like change things a little bit so that the modern people can understand because it's
Right.
sometimes a little obscure the way people talked. And there's like another fun website I found called Green's Dictionary of Slang that's really fun. It has these historical like slang phrases that you can look at and you can spend hours there. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, and that's a good point you raised. If you're talking about American history, there's places to go, and I think obviously every story will have its own background, its own history, and
hmm
so I guess this is going to get a little bit wonky because I know we have a list of questions, but I want to ask, when it comes to the story, do you pick kind of a scene or a moment in history that you want to write about? Do you start with a story? Like, where do you begin in your creative process with that?
It varies a little bit. I think I tend to begin with an idea of a story that I want to tell, and then I'll often look to like what historical period that would might happen in. But it does vary a little bit. So I usually have like kind of a vague idea of the type of story, like what the plot I'm looking for is, and then I find a place in history where that might fit. But I tend to stick with like early American history because it's my most enjoyed like area. I have it's a little different because I have a Western that I'm putting out in August
That's
that
very exciting.
that that came from like really the character was the first thing that came to me and then I she had a story to tell so it kind of varies a little bit.
And then when you're going through and you're finding resources online or through the archives, do you go about have you had experience going through for primary resources, like maybe interviews with people or any of that kind of stuff as well.
Yeah, I've so primary resources being like stuff by people from the time frame, writing about that specifically.
Yeah.
I have been able to find some interesting things related to that. Not always like entirely specific to the exact like event that I'm writing about, but like events surrounding that. I found some really obscure like autobiographies of Revolutionary War soldiers that were like written back then, and they're really short. They're usually fairly short and they're out of print, but I have found some really interesting like primary resources like that.
Cool. Do you find that do you find the research or the writing more enjoyable or more exciting, I guess?
Definitely the writing.
Yeah, that's fair.
Research is fun, but it's after a while you just want to write the story and stop researching.
So I guess stemming off of that, how do you tend to find kind of balance within remaining historically accurate, but also, like you said, like changing things up to be more in sync with how the modern reader would read language
Mhm.
usage and like
Yeah.
tension and all that kind of stuff?
So I do sometimes deviate a little bit from the historical record. It depends on the story. For La Belle Famille, pretty much stayed within the bounds of the historical facts of what exactly happened and how it was like everything that was recorded. But the characters, there's not a lot written about the character Launure, for example, so I was able to kind of use some imagination to flesh him out. So, and then for historical fantasy like Firefax, it's much more like loose, and I'm able to kind of play a little bit more. But I find that when I'm writing like straight historical fiction, it's really important for me to stay mostly within the bonds of the events that actually happened. But because the characters that I'm writing about are fictional, that's where you can have a little bit more freedom with how they interact with those
I
events.
see.
If
So
that makes
you stick like within the framework of the scene, but
hmm
the characters, yeah, there's only so much you can know about people, and like at the end of the day, it is still historical fiction. Like there
Yeah.
is still like an element, a very large element of storytelling there.
Yep. Yep.
Um, that's
And sometimes I think just like I said, like kind of the perspective of that fictional character, like how they're interacting with that event, like like sheds a lot of fresh, like sort of light on what happened.
interesting.
So I think that helps me to feel a little more free and not like stuck in the structure.
Yeah, I think especially with obviously we grew up today and having experienced life today and then having to rewind 2, 3, 400 years and then put yourself in their shoes, it could not have been easy because like kind of stemming off of that, when you are developing the characters and you want to make them feel authentic, how like what is that process like?
It's tricky because you want to make sure that they're having the kind of concerns they'd have at that time frame. And so they wouldn't necessarily be worried about the same things we are today, and
Yeah.
their day-to-day life looked quite a bit different. I feel like that if you take it to the extreme, modern readers really wouldn't enjoy the story. They'd be like, this nothing with this like really like relates to me. But I think that all through history, like people have always been like their biggest concerns, their biggest problems are all relationship based, and that hasn't really changed. Like the biggest problems in your life, the things that occupy the mind the most are like your family, your parents, your children, your siblings, your friends. And so I think because my characters are concerned with that more than anything. I think that's what makes them relatable, like to modern
Yeah.
day readers, because that hasn't changed. People are still worried about their family relationships. That's where a lot of the
That's a good
tension is.
point. It's finding the common ground between the modern reader and what might have happened back then. Obviously, there's all these different elements of clothing or the way that like the style which they live. Like, forgive me, it's been a minute since I've read the story, but I remember the three of them were living in this kind of house, kind of cave together,
Hmm
and we can visualize that, but we can't empathize with that. I would say the vast majority of us couldn't empathize with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so finding that common ground in relationships is
Mhm.
really interesting, or the work-life balance or lack
Right.
thereof, and all
Right.
of this. And I think we all have a semblance of home, irregardless of whether or not we live in a cave, for lack of a better word. Like everyone has what that form of nostalgia and that element
Mhm.
of whether it be religious or spirituality and this and that as well. That seems to transcend time, irregardless.
Yeah.
Transcend, but also maybe fluctuate in what it means over time.
Yeah.
But that is really interesting, especially with in La Belle Famille when you had the elements of just kind of hoping that everyone was okay the whole time
Yeah.
because you had the interrelational dynamics there. It's just like, oh man, like, but instead of just being able to text, you had to go through letters and you had to run around and really just hope for the best. So I can imagine that spiking a bunch of emotions as well.
Many people, not everybody, reads for like escapism. So, like, you have to have a world that feels real and characters that feel real. And like, this could have happened and this could be happening to really get people to immerse themselves in because they're trying to escape from modern life. So,
So then, kind of growing off of that, obviously you said you've written historical fantasy afterwards. What's the biggest things that you've learned since writing historical fiction? How has your process kind of evolved and been shaped over time here?
I think when I first started, I didn't do as much research at the very beginning, and I did a lot of research later in the process and then had to change many things.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
now I tend to do a lot of the research kind of on the front end and, try to learn as much as I can about the specific events that the story is going to be around. But I still give myself permission to, like, as I'm writing it, be like, just put a little note in here. This needs more research. Like, I need to, like, delve a little deeper into this aspect. So I think that was kind of the biggest change, making sure that I do a bunch of research at the beginning but I don't let that stop me when I'm writing because I can always go back and shift some things after I've done some further research.
Well, I feel like it has to muddle the creative process a little bit in terms of, well, like everything's about finding balance, but you have to find that balance between how much research am I going to do and how much am I going to leave up to chance here. Because at the end of the day,
Mhm.
everyone has their own creative process. But I know for myself, if I spend 30 hours researching something, it's very much going to skew where my creative process leads.
For sure.
So, huh.
It can be a little challenging and
Yeah,
and
I
sometimes you
believe
have to like especially like the work I'm working on now, I feel
that.
like the events that I'm writing about, like this is a very like the more I read, the more there is, like it just keeps going. And I'm like, eventually here we've got to stop and like keep writing. So as I can go back and check the things and it'll be fine.
Have you run into issues where you want to tell it one way and then history is showing another aspect, so you end up diverting the history, or is that where you take the fiction aspect and expand on it instead?
I think I've done both where I've found like historically this is not what happened. So I will then go back and sort of amend the story.
Mhm.
That can be as simple as like, for example, in La Belle Famille at the end during the battle, when I read it over like the kind of close to the last time, I was like, oh no, this is not exactly how this was documented, like how the battle went down. So I had to change a few little things about like which unit was coming in and what exactly was happening. So it
Okay.
can change the story a little bit. And then I've had other moments, for example, that, like I said, like I couldn't find a lot of information on Launier. So one of the sources that I read about him sort of m- indicated that he may have been someone that drank a fair amount of alcohol.
Yeah.
But I did not make him that in the story. I made his son like that in the story. So sometimes I'm like, we'll just change this a little bit.
You have creative freedom.
Yeah.
And one of the things I want to ask, and this might be less about historical fiction and more about just research and writing in general, is La Belle Famille in particular has a lot of well, obviously the titles in French. You have the Canadian, the French,
Yeah.
the English, the French, the British, as you always do, and
Hmm.
then natives mixed in there. And you have, like I said, it's been a minute since I've read this, so I'm forgetting the specific tribes, but you have
Yeah.
native languages
Hmm.
throughout. How did you go about that? And are these languages from the era or are these modern that you then brought back? Has it changed much?
The French, I was certainly helped by my husband who speaks fluent French. The German, like, it's fairly easy to find a translator to check the German phrases. So a lot of that, like all of that, I had checked by a German speaker. And then the native languages were quite difficult because unfortunately they're a lot of them like were near extinction. Some of them are virtually extinct with only a few speakers. So I did find books that were from the era that were like dictionaries and able to find some information from those. And then tracking down a native speaker was really tough, but I did eventually find a native speaker to check the phrases in Seneca more than anything because it was very, yeah. So
And
that was tricky, but
can I
all
ask
people that
how?
I paid for their assistance. But yeah, that's a big part of it is like finding someone who speaks it in the Western, there's some phrases interestingly, in Albanian that I was able to find an Albanian speaker to help go over these phrases and fix them. And part of her insight was this person would speak a certain way back then, and the phrases that you find with like Google Translate are not, the same. That's modern and potentially incorrect. So she was able to adjust things and make them more like how that person would have spoken back then. So it's
That's a
very helpful.
I believe it. No, that's a great point. Is that like we spoke earlier about the syntax and everything in English has changed over the hundreds of years. But if French wasn't your first language or German wasn't your first language or all of these, like they also would have shifted over time. I
Hmm.
think I mean, I know there's languages out there that have remained pretty insular. I don't know if that's the right word, but pretty similar to
Stat.
how they were, static, yes.
Mhm.
Um, but most of them haven't. So it is interesting to see how that shifted.
Yeah.
And can I ask when it came about, obviously you just said you paid people, how did you go about kind of that process? Because for me, like that's a very solid primary source and resource there. How did you go about that to find the translator and all that?
So some of them can be found on like Fiverr, for example. So you can
Yeah.
find a someone that speaks the language there. And so for languages that are more modern, for like Seneca, it's very tricky. There's like an agency in Canada where they have translators for a lot of very obscure like First Nations languages and things like that. And it was actually through them that I was able to connect with a translator. So it was a little tricky trying to find, because I did reach out to people that had blogs about the language and things like that. Some of them didn't feel comfortable because they were not experts at the language. They're still trying to learn it themselves. So it was challenging.
No, that's fair. I think that's all part of the process, and that's what helps make the story so authentic and unique. Is the fact that like, yeah, it's one thing to write a fiction; it's another thing to go through and make sure all these things are aligning, and the everyday reader might not recognize that or appreciate like all the
Mhm.
work that does go into making sure that this is the context, this is how it's meant to be used, especially stories that have multiple languages throughout, and
Mhm.
languages play an important role in the story as well.
Mhm.
So we're running low on time here, so I want to follow up with kind of one of the questions I've been most excited about is while you've been doing your research for a story, like while you've been doing research for a story, has there ever been anything that really like stands out to you that's absolutely shocked you that you've been like, oh wow, did not expect that?
Yeah. So this will come into play with the sequel for Firefax that is not yet released, but it's not really a spoiler. I was very interested to find that in 1782, General Washington has authorized this colonel to just go ahead and kidnap the Prince of England, William Henry, who was then in New York with the Navy. And so I found that very interesting, but you'd have to read the book to see how it plays out.
That's fair enough. I can only imagine the things you stumble upon. Yeah, that's I would have never thought that. That's a bold play.
Yeah.
I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, especially since they had technically won the war at that point. So he's
Yeah,
like,
that,
go ahead.
that feels like a slap in the face. But on that note, thank you so much for taking the time. I think it's elements like these where it provides us with an opportunity to get more resources out there. And, if you ever want to write historical fiction, I feel like this is a good place to start, have some understanding, and then follow your journey. But thank you again, Amelia. If you
Thank
haven't
you.
read her story, it's La Belle Famille. It's real fun historical fiction. And like you, if you just listened, probably know it's as historically accurate as can be. So thanks again, guys.